there is really no love lost here from the sort of white supremacist perspective towards the Native Americans, but the Native Americans are just basically making a kind of pragmatic decision at this point. And the very last Confederate general to surrender in the war is Standwatie, is the Cherokee Nation. The Cherokee have a spirit called the Nunehi. They will hide people in the caves until the bad thing has passed and then release them again. All non-white churchgoers had to have a white pastor preaching to them, because it was considered dangerous if there was a black pastor potentially preaching abolition. Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote famously Uncle Tom's Cabin, Lincoln had actually said to her, so you're the little lady that started this big war. In the 1950s, the Lumbee took their name from the river, but one thing they claimed to be at one point was Cherokee. They are put in forced labour gangs, and as a result, they say, well, screw this, we're joining the North.
Welcome to the Echo Changer podcast with myself, Jacob.
And myself, Harley.
So yeah, today we're going to be covering a bit more about the American Civil War, but more specifically about the Native American participation in that, as well as their relationship with both sides of the conflict as well. But yeah, really excited to get into this one. Looking forward to yet more knowledge from our American Civil War expert, Harley. So
in-house expert.
No, it's good. But yeah, no, we're really getting into the.
No, I'm still learning. I mean, it's fascinating. What I love about this is even a topic, because a lot of the topics you'll know more about than me, but then this is one where I'm obviously leading. The fascinating thing is that the more you learn about a topic, even one that you think you know a lot about already, the more you realise you don't know, and the more the kind of the smaller the little niches and the nooks and crannies that you can kind of get into and sink your teeth into. It's really, really good fun.
Yeah, absolutely. There's always different things that you didn't know about before. I think that's one of the best things about history.
Endless. I mean, you could go forever, and I'm sure there are wonderful, the Bruce Cattons and the Shelby Footes and the C. Van Woodwards of this world who are the great Civil War experts. I'm sure they had moments where they thought, hang on, what? I didn't know that. So it's just, I mean, Shelby Foote himself, an extraordinary man. He wrote what's considered to be the definitive kind of narrative history of the war, which is just called the Civil War, and it's 3 volumes of about 1,000 pages each.
Wow.
And those are big pages with small text as well. It is absolutely enormous. I've got it as a kind of trophy almost on my shelf, but there's no way in hell I'm ever reading the whole thing.
I want to know the word count of that book.
Yeah, exactly. Funny, just quickly, a funny story on that. My dad's godfather recently passed away, a man called Willis Witchett, who was a Supreme Court justice in North Carolina, so a state Supreme Court justice, not a federal one. But he was a very well-connected man, knew lots of people. There's a fabulous picture of him shaking Clinton's hand back in the day that he used to be very proud of. But he loved Shelby Foote's history, and he had a first edition copy of it, a beautiful first edition copy, which I was very envious of. And he always used to tell the story that Shelby was a Mississippi man, kind of gruff, slightly very charming, but not all that sociable Southerner, and he really didn't like signing. He wouldn't sign copies of his books. He thought it was a waste of time, and he wouldn't do it. But my Willis Witchett, my dad's godfather, was very, very pleased with himself because he managed to persuade Shelby Foote to sign a copy for him. So he would, this among all the other things he would sort of proudly show you. He once took me and my dad tramping around Raleigh, North Carolina, in the sweltering August heat to see all of the portraits of him in all the various courthouses. So, and he was very spry kind of sprightly. Even then, I mean, he must have been at least 70 then, and he was kind of pacing along and very energetically, and we were kind of panting and wheezing behind him, trying to keep up. As he tracked us from one courthouse to another. A wonderful man, a real eccentric. But he himself, I believe his grandson, a guy called Chamberlain, was a real sort of Civil War kind of nerd, absolutely knows it inside out. And so he once made the mistake of saying to Chamberlain, who was then 13 years old, he said to him, "Oh, there's this book by a guy called Shelby Foote, and it's very long." And no doubt he would have told him the story about how he managed to get Shelby to sign it for him. And Chamberlain looked back at him and said, "Oh yes, Grandpa, I've read it 3 times." And you thought, "Oh my God, this 13-year-old has read the entirety of Shelby Foote, all 3,000 pages of it 3 times." And he would. My dad tells a funny story that they went to Gettysburg together, the 3 of them, and for a tour. And the poor old tour guide got more than he bargained for, because Chamberlain, every time he opened his mouth, Chamberlain would correct him very pointedly, about the various things he was getting wrong. As if this poor tour guide was had to.
He was about to take his job.
Pride. Yeah, his pride suffered a little bit there, but I think he managed to get through it. Anyway, but no, Shelby Foote's wonderful, and if you watch, as I hope you will, Ken Burns' Civil War documentary, Shelby Foote is one of the leading kind of talking heads in that, and there is, I think, as an extra on the DVD, on the remaster of the DVD, which I may invest in. I have a very old kind of crackly copy of it. But that has its own sort of charms, a bit like sort of vinyl records versus tidied up digital. There is that, you can see, and I think it's on YouTube as well, just the full unedited interview with Shelby Foote, and it is worth if you don't watch anything else of it, it's worth watching that, because he's just such a charming, fascinating guy, and he has all the stories at the tip of his tongue. But anyway, I digress. I think I will be telling you today specifically about the Cherokee. So, having started with a little bit of personal stuff around North Carolina, it's appropriate that I say that the Cherokee are our local Indian nation. And they have land in what's called the Qualla boundary, or the Qualla town, which is land that they have clung onto through the various trials and tribulations of the Cherokee through the years. So I'll start us off at 1830, because in order to understand where Native Americans end up by the time they get to the Civil War, and what considerations are going to drive which side they decide to side with, it's important to understand the history. So in 1830, there's a thing called the Indian Removal Act. So President Andrew Jackson is very aggressively kind of anti-Indian, as they were then known, president. He basically forces the Cherokee and the other of the 5 civilized tribes, so I believe it's the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creek, and the Seminole. Might have to fact check myself on that, but I believe those are the 5 quote-unquote civilized tribes. So civilized here meaning they had taken on a certain amount of European dress and custom and language and religion, so that they were able to sort of negotiate with the sort of white European settlers in a way that some of the other tribes who hadn't made that transition were not so much able to. So anyway, there's the Indian Removal Act, which is basically lays out the framework for the forced relocation of the 5 civilized tribes to what was then called Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma. So the portion of Oklahoma that the quote-unquote 5 civilized tribes were relocated to is in the northeastern portion of what is now Oklahoma. So what's interesting about the Cherokee is, whilst a lot of Indian tribes are kind of lock, stock and barrel, shipped out, and they have no way of counteracting it. In 1832, there's a case, Worcester versus Georgia, where the US Supreme Court rules that the Cherokee Nation is in fact a sovereign entity, and that Georgia laws have no force in their territory. So in the Georgia portion of the Cherokee, it spreads out, through North Carolina, Georgia. In Georgia, they have sort of land rights here, which are butting up against this Forced Removal Act. However, Jackson refuses to enforce the ruling. So basically, he says, sort of bad luck. I'm sending you out anyway. In 1835, there's a thing called the Treaty of New Echota, where a small group of Cherokee, also known as the Treaty Party, willingly sign this removal treaty, but controversially within the tribe, they do not consult the chief of the tribe, a man called Chief John Ross, who is himself he's mixed blood himself. He's part white, part Native American. So, despite a petition signed by 15,000 of the Cherokee protesting its illegality, the U.S. Senate ratifies it. Obviously, they're going to take, if there's people within the nation, Cherokee Nation saying, yeah, let's go for it, and there's people saying no, let's not. They're obviously gonna listen to the ones who are saying, yeah, let's go for it, and going to ignore everybody else. So at this point, there is a sort of divide between the Treaty Party and, gosh, what are the other side called? I'm sure I'll get to it at some point. Anyway, there's the other party. So a man called Stand Watie. At this point, he's not particularly high ranking, but he's part of this Treaty Party, and he's going to become important soon, because in 1835 they willingly moved themselves to Indian Territory. Now, a few years later, in 1838 and 1839, we have what's called the Trail of Tears, which is following the deadline for voluntary removal. The army rounds up the Cherokee and basically says, right, we're off, off we go. And rounds them up, marches them on this incredibly grueling, horrible march westward. Thousands die along the way of disease, exposure, starvation during the 1,200 mile journey over to Indian Territory. So there's the Act of Union in 1839, which is where both the Western Cherokee, who had arrived first, the Treaty Party, as well as the Eastern Cherokee, those who had been forcibly moved later on, signed an agreement to join as a single body politic, establishing a new capital at Tahlequah in Indian Territory. So after that, it's obviously been a tumultuous kind of beginning, but after that, there's a decade where things go pretty smoothly. There's a Cherokee newspaper that's printed called the Cherokee Phoenix. Schools are thriving. There's even a female seminary for Christian women of the Cherokee Nation. They're speaking English as well as Cherokee. There's actually, I think a little earlier than this, but the Cherokee language is one of the few Indian languages that is actually codified in. It sort of has its own notation, has its own alphabet. A lot of Native American dialects are not written; they are merely spoken. Whereas Cherokee is kind of formalized into. So the Cherokee Phoenix newspaper is famously printed in both Cherokee and in English because they're able to do that. Anyway, so you have this interesting tension, nevertheless, bubbling under between those who had voluntarily agreed and thus kind of gone off half-cocked for the rest of them who wanted to stay put, and then those who were then forced out because of the fact that the other half, without their consent, had signed this treaty. And of course, they're even bitterer about it because the second lot that were forced out had a much more grueling time of it than the first lot who went out voluntarily, and also sort of signed the death warrant for the other lot who wanted to stay behind. So when the Civil War begins, this factional element between there's a guy called, as I said, Stand Watie, I think his nephew Elias Boudinot, and a family called the Ridges. They are kind of at the head of this Treaty Party faction. And then you have John Ross and his followers as the head of, again, can't remember the name, but the other sort of party. The Stand Watie party are very pro-Confederate. They are pragmatic, as had been shown by the fact that they willingly signed their own removal papers. They are thinking, right, okay, pragmatically, well, where are we? We're we're in Indian territory. Also, a lot of these, I think, including Stanwati, a lot of these Cherokees actually had slaves themselves. They had plantations often back east before they were moved out, where they owned slaves. So their way of life, again, going back to the 5 civilized tribes element, their life is kind of integrated with the sort of white European way of life in the south in a way that some of the other tribes aren't. So combination of factors, both political and kind of lifestyle related, mean that the treaty party side pretty instantaneously with the Confederacy. John Ross, however, is more ambivalent. He wants neutrality. Interestingly, he himself owns slaves, but he is not pro-Confederacy. He's kind of on the board. He's sort of on the line. He can see this. He can see both sides. But basically, what happens is because a lot of his followers are also slave owners, they are more keen to side with the South. So reluctantly, he says, "Okay, fine," and they sign a treaty with the Confederacy. Now, there is another kind of angle to this, which is just simply the geography of it. So they are in Oklahoma, just above Texas, and they are very much in the southern part of the world here, and it's very remote, and the Union Army is nowhere to be seen at this point. So if the question is, who do we side with? Is it the people who were right there, basically with a gun to our head saying, join us or else? Or is it the people who we'd have to wait weeks and weeks and weeks before we saw them, if we ever saw them?
Well, yeah, so whether they're ever even going to show up in the first place.
Exactly. So it's very much a sort of pragmatic thing of I guess we better side with the South, as well as there being, as I said, these kind of cultural political factors that are leaning them that way anyway. Because that, as well, you have to remember, although there is this sense that they are more aligned, more in tune with the kind of white European sort of southern way of life, the white Europeans are obviously white supremacist at this point. There is a racist ideology in the South which considers all non-whites to basically be in the same
category
boat.
for them.
So yes, exactly. So this is somewhat mitigated by the quote unquote civilized nature of the 5 tribes. That saves them somewhat because they have more in common with the white population. But as we will come to later, there are other tribes such as the Lumbee, who are a kind of sort of subsect of the Cherokee, although the Cherokee kind of disown them and don't like to say that they're related in any way, who had never taken on any of these kind of manners or institutions or religion, and so they are very much viewed as in the same category as blacks, as the slaves. So there is really no love lost here from the sort of white supremacist perspective towards the Native Americans, but the Native Americans are just basically making a kind of pragmatic decision at this point. Watty himself becomes he rises, I believe he's the only Native American to do so, he rises to the rank of brigadier general. He forms a company called the Cherokee Mounted Rifles, and his political opponent John Ross, after initially supporting the Confederacy and he had a, what was he called? Drew, a man called Drew, was again Native American, part of the Cherokee, was leading a unit of men who actually switched side at one point. And because Ross has connections with Drew, and Drew is making this pragmatic decision, I think it's even in the middle of a battle, they had what they called pins, which were sort of cross bits of metal. I don't know whether it was sort of crossed that way or crossed like a Christian cross, but they had cross bits of metal on their lapels, which indicated that they were fighting for the North.
Right.
That was one of the ways that they would differentiate themselves. So his company, Drew's company, switch basically in mid battle and totally switch sides, and John Ross then goes with him, because at this point the North have come down, they're involved, the fighting is happening, and they think, okay, if we switch sides now, we actually have some military weight behind us, and we have protection. So at that point, I can't remember the battle. I can probably put it up. At that point, John Ross actually switches sides. So you now have those internal kind of bubbling hostilities within the Cherokee Nation have now broken out into the open. They are on opposing sides of the war. So fast forwarding to the end of the war, curiously, so I told you last time about the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse between Grant and Lee. Now that is the kind of big one. That is the big surrender. But inevitably, like with all of these things, there are several armies at play. It's not just the Eastern Theatre. So gradually it trickles out. The various surrenders kind of happen. It's a sort of domino effect after Appomattox. And the very last Confederate general to surrender in the war is Standwatie, is the Cherokee Nation, Cherokee Mounted Rifles guy. So what happens afterwards, unfortunately, for those who have sided with the South, is that they are, again, we've seen the Union doing this before. If there's ever a sort of ambiguity, they're gonna come down hard on the side that basically punishes the Indians and cheats them of their land. And so this happens again in the case of the Civil War. The entire Cherokee Nation, even though it's split north and south, as we saw, they were treated as though they had been traitors by joining the South. So there is a thing called the 1866 Reconstruction Treaty, which is incredibly brutal to the Cherokee Nation in stripping it of its rights. Now, this is the Western story, the Western Cherokee, but I should say, going back, if we rewind now to 1835, pre-Trail of Tears, there is a portion of the Eastern Band, as they're called, the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, the EBCI, called the Oconaluftee, their sort of subsect, and they are led by a man called William Thomas, who's actually a white man by birth, but he is brought up by Chief Yonaguska of the Oconaluftee. And so he is somebody who is in a unique position, given his race and his obvious sort of Southern, or rather not even Southern, but American. He is treated as a fully blown American by others. He is able to negotiate from a position of power in a way that that sort of full-blooded Indians were not able to. So he actually is an extraordinarily. He does some incredible things, one of which is to buy up land. So there is an unusual status for the Oconaluftee in that they have this land I was telling you about, the Qualla town, the Qualla boundary, is this, and it's still there today, and it's I've been there, and it's a wonderful place, and they do a play called Unto These Hills, which was written in the 50s, but sort of updated in the 90s because it was written by white guys. And so in the 90s, they sort of redid it so that it took into account a little bit more kind of native perspectives. Yeah. But even then, it's still very sort of Disney-esque. It still feels like you're watching sort of like Pocahontas or something. It's strange because it's the native people themselves doing it, putting it on, but they're quite relaxed about who's playing what role. So they actually have at this theatre school that puts it on every year, and in this lovely open air theatre, they have black students, they have white students, they have Native American students, and they really don't care about the race. That they're not caught up in this current sort of Hollywood thing of kind of casting in direct relation to race and gender and all that kind of stuff. They will cast white guys as Indians and Indians as white guys, and so it's fascinating watching it as a play because it's all very fluid in a way that you wouldn't necessarily see in a kind of quote unquote white or sort of Hollywood style. Anyway, that's a sort of diversion from the point, but it's a fascinating place to visit. But William Thomas himself had purchased this land, so it was private land. So it was treated in a legal sense. It was much more ironclad than were Indian reservation lands, because they couldn't just be taken away because he had solid legal ownership of the land. Yeah. So he did an enormous service to the Cherokee in purchasing Quallatown. So basically, when the Trail of Tears comes in 1838, those who are in that area are safe from the depredations of the Trail of Tears. They're not forced west. They actually, interestingly, the Cherokee have a spirit called the Nunehi, which is a mythological sort of spirit character in their folklore, and they are supposedly, they're sort of ghosts that that dwell in the caves, and they come and they will hide people. These spirits, when there's bad things happening out in the world, they will hide people in the caves until the bad thing has passed, and then release them again. And this is kind of, in a sense, a sort of mythological expression of the very real factor of some Cherokee being saved from being forced onto the Trail of Tears. So it's all fascinating stuff. But basically, Thomas is he's a fierce, as well as being, a great defender of Cherokee rights. He's also a fiercely pro-Southern kind of secesh fire eater. So he has no military training, interestingly, at all, but he's just got real kind of chutzpah. He forms what's called Thomas's Legion, which is almost a sort of guerrilla force. It's kind of paramilitary. It's not. He's sort of, because the Confederate command in Raleigh, within the North Carolina kind of sphere of things, is very, very far away and remote from the mountains. So this is the Appalachian Mountains we're back in again.
Yeah.
Sorry, I should have situated us to begin with. We're in the Appalachian Mountains. We're in the northwest of North Carolina, way up in the mountains. So it's obviously very remote, and he is basically kind of a man on the spot in the old style of he is basically told, okay, well, do your thing, but just don't get us into any hot water if you can avoid it. Just try and do what you think is the right thing to do. Basically, he's told, and so he goes, okay. So he takes this kind of license that he's given, and he forms this incredibly hardy group of men who basically make it their business to guard the mountain passes, so the sort of valleys between the mountains where Union troops would come if they were marching. They'd obviously find those, but so they would guard the mountain passes and they would ambush Union troops as they were passing through. That was one of their kind of roles, and the other role is that they would hunt down deserters, Confederate deserters, and sort of bring them to justice. Reconscript them into the ranks, essentially. So they and he was pretty fierce, Thomas. He was totally self-driven. I mean, he didn't have to do any of this, but he just totally took the initiative and formed this incredibly hardy group called Thomas's Legion to basically enforce. They kind of acted as like a sort of corollary to the Home Guard. So as I told you about before, that the Home Guard are the Southern families in each town that sort of police the towns and make sure they sort of root out deserters and they requisition supplies and all that kind of jazz. So Thomas's Legion, they sort of see themselves as a kind of extension of the Home Guard in that sense. They're not a kind of obvious military unit that has plans and positions and goals, and they are just sort of roaming around in the mountains of North Carolina and Tennessee, on that borderline. Yeah. Just basically sort of wreaking havoc with the Union troops. So yeah, that's the story of both the Western Cherokee and the Eastern Cherokee. But there's one more story, which is that of the Lumbee Native Americans. So the Lumbee are really interesting. They're almost a kind of lost tribe in a sense. They have always struggled, even to this day. They have struggled to kind of get a sense of their history and their identity. Some people think that they sprung from originally a lost colony that had come over in the 1600s and interbred with Native Americans in the local area around sort of Wilmington, North Carolina, so on the coast in the sort of southeast of the state. But that seems to be largely discredited. But the reason they're called the Lumbee is because they are situated around the Lumber River,
Right.
which is one of the rivers, along with the big one, Cape Fear, that comes in from which the film gets its name. The big river that comes in at Wilmington, North Carolina, kind of cuts up through the state. In the 1950s, the Lumbee took their name from the river, but they've always had this kind of strange kind of identity crisis. They don't quite know who they are. But one thing they claimed to be at one point was Cherokee. So there is this sense that they are a kind of a subsect of the Cherokee, but the Cherokee themselves have always kind of looked down their noses at them and said, "No, you're not one of us." You know, they are treated very poorly, and in the various what are called black codes, which are brought in after the Nat Turner Rebellion of 1831. So there were Nat Turner, to go back, Nat Turner was a slave who rose up in 1931. He and an armed group of slaves killed their masters and went on a kind of rampage. And in amongst their gang were Native Americans as well. Mm-hmm. So because of that, the Native Americans at large were in the subsequent legal codes that came in, called the Black Codes, which basically prevented it lumped all non-whites together in a legal sense. So before then, you actually had, if you were a free person of colour, if you were a free non-white, you could actually vote. You had certain rights. Remarkably, I mean, it seems unlikely, but
given the time,
given the time. But in North Carolina, you did actually have political rights. So basically, these black codes they strip all non-whites of any of these kind of privileges and rights, and basically because also there had been kind of firebrand preachers involved in all of this, sort of firebrand abolitionist preachers. It was said that all non-white churchgoers had to have a white pastor preaching to them, because it was considered dangerous if there was a black pastor potentially preaching abolition. You had the stripping of all voting rights from non-enslaved non-whites. So all sorts of restrictions coming in. So basically, the Lumbee Indians are kind of thrown in with essentially with the slaves, and they are treated as such. They are forced into sort of chain gangs. They are put in forced labor gangs, building Confederate forts, ironworks, all sorts, along the Cape Fear and its various tributaries. So they're treated absolutely abysmally. And as a result, they say, "Well, screw this. We're joining the North. We want to fight for the North because we're in a very different position to those Eastern Cherokee over there who actually have kind of land rights and are being treated okay." So a particular gang rises up out of this group called the Lowry Gang. So there's a guy called Henry Berry Lowry, and he is again a mixed race, white Native American, and he forms, along with his brothers and their friends, they form a sort of Robin Hood gang. So they will hold people up. They will perform robberies and all the rest of it. But they will be very courteous to those whom they consider to be poor or sort of amongst or sort of one of them, but they will be very, very brutal and nasty indeed to those who they consider to be rich. There are swamps in North Carolina, Virginia. Famously, there's one called the Great Dismal Swamp, which has its own people called the Maroons, who are a mixed. They're a combination of Native Americans and runaway slaves who have hidden in the swamps. So the Maroons have they are their own sort of people who specifically exist in the Great Dismal Swamp that's on the border of North Carolina and Virginia. And interestingly, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote famously Uncle Tom's Cabin, which kind of was one of the kind of sparks for the Civil War. It sort of woke the Northern public up to the horrific nature of slavery through this very, very sort of melodramatic but very powerful story. And the phrase Uncle Tom itself now, i.e. referring to a sort of race traitor from within the black community, referring to a sort of race traitor, dates back to Uncle Tom's Cabin, the character of Uncle Tom. Anyway, so she and Lincoln had actually said to her, he's full of great witty remarks, when he finally meets her during the war itself. So she'd written the book, I think, in the early 1850s, but he meets her during the war itself, and he says, so you're the little lady that started this big war. Because it was considered to be a real kind of catalyst for, especially in the North, for sort of hardening of abolitionist attitudes. A lot of the Lumbee Indians hide in various swamps to avoid being press ganged by the Home Guard into these forced labour units, and so these swamps become a kind of nest of resistance, because swamps are very hard to penetrate, especially with kind of guns, and it's very difficult to get into. I don't know if you've seen, there's a great film called The Free State of Jones with Matthew McConaughey, which if you haven't seen, I'd highly recommend. It's Matthew McConaughey plays a southern deserter in Mississippi and it's a true story, who flees and finds himself in this swamp with runaway slaves, forms a kind of bond with them, and he actually declares, he kind of secedes this little town next to the swamp. He kind of takes it over, and they fight off the Southern Army, and he declares this the Free State of Jones. He kind of secedes from the Confederacy. They have their own flag and all sorts, but the Germanists, the kind of the foundation of this is the fact that he was able to hide. The swamps were a fantastic place to hide, because they're just very, very difficult to get to. Even if you knew there were deserters and runaways, hiding
so hard
was incredibly
to get
difficult to actually. Yeah, and if you could kind of master that terrain, which is horrible terrain, but if you can master it, then you're kind of invincible. There's these swamps called the Scuffletown swamps, and there's a mixture of Lumbee Indians, blacks, whites, again, deserters. They raid wealthy planters, the Home Guard, and this is right at the end of the war and into Reconstruction that they are operating. Eventually, in 1868, the leader of the gang, Henry Berry Lowry, he is arrested at his own wedding. He then escapes from jail by filing through the bars of the jail with a file that his wife had smuggled into him. So he's on the run. The gang is outlawed. There's a sort of bounty on their head of $12,000, and eventually he disappears in 1872. He flees after a raid on a local store where they took several $1,000s. He vanishes into thin air. And the remaining members meet a kind of sad fate. They're all sort of killed, captured, hunted down, and the very last of them, Steve Lowry, was killed in 1874. So a real stark contrast to the Eastern and Western Cherokee, in that they have motivations completely to go the other way and to fight against the Confederacy rather than for the Confederacy. And again, if Thomas's Legion was the kind of guerrilla band up in the mountains, the Lowry Gang was the sort of guerrilla force in the swamp regions, in the low lying lands, coastal plains. But of course, fighting against the South rather than for it.
Yeah.
I mean, there are endless factions, there are endless tribes that you could discuss, but I thought I'd focus on the Cherokee because you do have this interesting contrast between a bit like with Maryland as a subject. You have North and you have South, and you have interesting, complicated motives as to why some would fight for one side and some would fight for another.
Yeah, because I think again, you would probably think, like, without knowing anything about the conflict at all, you might be tempted to assume that, all Native American tribes would have been fighting against the Confederacy because of, the obviously, Confederates oppressed people through slavery.
Yeah.
And you would have thought that maybe, in a similar marginalized position, they may have all decided to naturally fight on the side against the Confederates. But I think when it comes to the realization that there's a complex relationship between different factions within Native American tribes, and both sides of the conflict, I think it then makes it interesting to see the nuances between those. So, like, obviously, there's parts of them, the parts of the Cherokee that obviously, they have slaves. They are very kind of pro keeping that way of life going, and they kind of have their position is almost, we've got a good thing going here. Let's not like mess it up. And then they obviously then side with the Confederates. But then on the other side, you've then got others that are being, hounded off their land. They're being sent further west. And it's more increasingly difficult to kind of maintain the life that they've had for themselves. So then completely. It becomes it's a different story altogether. And that's just within the same tribe. And that narrative, obviously, I'm assuming would happen across loads of different tribes across America during this time period. So yeah, I think it's a really good example to bring up, to be honest.
Good. Well, I'm glad it's kind of, it's one of those things. I mean, it's a strange paradox, because I feel like you can deal with the whole war much more easily than you can deal with a faction of it, a sort of a facet of it rather. Because, and this is such a specific niche, such a specific facet, that there's almost kind of, it almost multiplies the number of different threads that you could choose to follow, and makes it quite tricky to choose just one. So I hope that in focusing in on the Cherokee, I've kind of been able to give you a kind of picture of how that sort of operates within the broader scale. Just as hopefully me telling you a bit more about Maryland and Baltimore is also, it's a good kind of microcosm for divided loyalties, why people go the way that they go. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think it's, with big topics like this, it is easier to not only understand it when you're coming at it from a perspective of not really knowing anything about the topic itself. I think it's a lot easier to understand the bigger picture by focusing in on one particular, say, like region or something where there are split loyalties and there are people on both sides. I think it makes it a little easier to understand in that way. So yeah, hopefully,
I'm glad.
Hopefully for all you listening at home, also that is the same case. But yeah, it's been super fun, very intriguing. And yeah,
I'm glad.
I think we've covered quite a few different things on the American Civil War quite well, and found it a fascinating topic. So looking forward to covering more of it.
I mean, I'd happily turn this into a Civil War podcast, but no, actually, on that topic, there's a really, really good Civil War podcast by a couple, who are called Richard and Tracy, and they are, one of them is a Northerner and one of them is a Southerner, interestingly, and they have this nice kind of cutesy sort of married couple vibe, but they are still going now, but they started, I think they started this podcast in like 2012.
Oh, wow.
And they have been working their way. Yeah, they have been working their way through the build up to the war itself and Reconstruction. They've been working their way through all of it since like 2012, and they come out with an episode like every week, and it is extraordinary. I mean, the level of the depth of the reading that they do, and they have kind of like a reading list at the end of each podcast where they tell you kind of where they're getting their information from, and it is absolutely extraordinary, and just the sheer commitment of it is incredible. They're on like episode, I think it's like 400 and something. Wow. And they're only at like 1864. They've still got they're at the Atlanta. Yeah, they're at Sherman's March to Atlanta at the moment, and they've still got a way to go. And they're calling it the Civil War and Reconstruction podcast. So presumably they're going to go right through to kind of anywhere as close as kind of the 1890s towards the end of Reconstruction. So you can, it's one of those topics you can just endlessly drill into. There's just the more you learn, the more you learn there is to learn, because it's extraordinary. And I was listening to their podcast religiously for a while, and I did give up in the end because it is just so enormous and it's so detailed. And if you kind of fall out of love with the subject for a while, it's difficult to kind of maintain that same kind of commitment to it, because it is so rich in detail. But it's wonderful. I came to it a couple of times in preparation for this, actually, for a couple of things, because they're so good.
Yeah.
And you can, if you find the episode in question, sort of 30-40 minutes just on that very specific topic is really, really good.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Oh yeah, it's brilliant. I recommend it to anyone who wants a deep dive on the Civil War, a deeper dive even than Ken Burns gives you in his sort of 10 hours of the great documentary. I would highly recommend. I think it's just called Civil War and Reconstruction.
Mm-hmm.
And they are incredible, and untiring, unflagging in their devotion to their subject.
Yeah, well, they're 400 and so episodes in. Maybe one day we'll get to 400 episodes.
Well, it's a goal to aim for.
That's the goal.
It's a goal to aim for sure.
So yeah, and on that note, I think that's a good place to end it. Thank you very much for listening, and really excited to see you on the next one.
Thank you. Especially the Confederate women, but Northern women too, would sew into these big fashionable hoop skirts that they had. Guns, but letters primarily, coded messages, supplies. They're running messages back and forth. Pinkerton had been tracking her, caught her handing over her coded message, and put her under house arrest. The ship runs aground. She gets into a little rowboat, but the rowboat capsizes, and the weight of the gold coins in her skirt pulls her under and drowns her, very sadly. She reads this book in which a woman disguises herself as a man and kind of leads a life of daring do. And she's inspired by this, and she thinks, one day I'm going to pretend to be a man and I'm going to become a soldier. And this she does. He is shocked, he is upset, he does feel betrayed, but he doesn't reveal her secret. So she leads them back, and of course, out of the bushes come all the Confederate soldiers who round up the two kind of surprised Union soldiers, and she says to them, "These are the cowardly Confederates you were talking about. They're not so cowardly now, are they?" or something,